Shalom, 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 shalom. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's doing well. Shalom, shalom to everybody tuning in. Everybody's doing well. Shalom to everybody's tuning in. What's going on? Be here in just a second. We're going to be going live here in just a second here. Hope everyone is doing awesome, having an awesome time. What's going on, everybody? Shalom, shalom. 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 What's going on? What's going on? Shalom. Blessings to you. Blessings to everybody. I am still waiting here. Just sent the link to Dr. Tudor. So waiting on him. Meanwhile, I'm going to play a video here, and we're going to get things going here. Okay. Hope everybody's doing well.
Thank you very much. Teachers at Oxford were often going on about the fact that the furthest east that any Orientalists needed to go was Leipzig. And the reason for this was that it was considered that people studying the East didn't really need to go there. You could study the people and the place from a distance, and particularly in a library. And it just so happens that Leipzig is the most easterly of the great European Orientalist libraries. But I'm not that kind of scholar. I've had a lot of adventures in my life, and I've had a lot of journeys. And the most exciting of these, in many ways, and this is really rather surprising and astonishing, was in Africa. Now, why should this be surprising? It's surprising because I am a student of Jewish studies, and particularly remote Jewish communities throughout the world. And whereas, of course, there were Jews in places like Europe and the Caucasus and Central Asia, and of course, on the Silk Route as far as China, there were no Jews in pre-modern times in Black Africa, with the exception of one or two references in very, very dodgy medieval texts suggesting that there might be some lost cities and the occasional Jewish king somewhere in the heart of the unknown continent. This is how it happened. To South Africa to give a lecture at the University of Witwatersrand. And it was a hall a bit like this. The place was full of very well-dressed, affluent-looking white South Africans. And they listened very attentively, sitting in their comfortable, well-upholstered chairs to what I had to say. But at the back of the hall, there was quite a large group of very poorly dressed black people, shoeless, but they were wearing little black skull caps. And after my lecture, I went across, introduced myself, and we started to chat. And they explained that they were members of the Lemba tribe. And then, to my great astonishment again, they said that they were black Jews who'd come hundreds or perhaps thousands of years before into Africa from somewhere in the north and from a city that they referred to as Senna. And they had a kind of epic poem which they started chanting to me, and it went something like this. White men who came from Senna. We crossed Pusela. We crossed the sea. We came to Africa. We rebuilt Senna. We are the white men who came from Senna. We followed the star. We carried the ark. Pretty amazing song. And then they said that they would like me to go and visit them. And they lived 6 or 7 hours north of where we were, right up against the frontier with Zimbabwe in little thatched villages. And off I went and spent a little time there, several days. And at night, I would sit out with the old men and they would tell me stories of their journey across Africa, of their Jewish customs, of their circumcision rites and their ritual slaughter of animals. And most astonishingly, they told me how their priests, because there was a priestly clan, how their priests carried something like the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders on poles right across the continent. Well, it was a pretty amazing story, and I was amazed as a Jewish scholar that I didn't know about it. There was no...
All right, brothers and sisters, what's going on? We are going to now bring on Dr. Tudor Parfitt. We thank you all for watching the intro to TED. And so this is something that is definitely important, and I'm excited about this as of now. So I'm waiting on Dr. Parfitt to come on, and we will be ready to go. He's connecting to his audio now, and so we will be ready to go here in just a few seconds, as soon as he comes on. Let's see here. So right now we're waiting on connecting. We're connecting through Zoom. So we're just waiting on Dr. Parfitt to come on. But while we are waiting on him to connect, hold on, let me see here. Just had a situation. Let me see here. Let me send him another invite. It knocked him out for some reason. So let me send him another invite. Okay, so let's see here. We're going to see how this works. Hopefully we can get him on, trying to get through some of the technical difficulties of things, and so we can jump in here.
world than the Jews. And yet in the whole realm of Jewish scholarship, there was no mention of these people and these remarkable stories. So I felt that I absolutely had to find out whether these people were genuinely Jewish in the first place, and I wondered if this was possible. And I also needed to find out where their lost city of Senna was.
All right, here we go. All right, we're trying to connect to get them connected.
Now I'm connected. You can hear me?
There you go. Dr. Parfitt, what's going on? How you doing?
I see you're a pretty dab hand at the technology, so that's pretty good. I'm in safe hands.
I'm trying to work on it. I just actually got on Zoom today, so I had one of the brothers in our congregation show me how to do it. So I got just the basics down. So excited about that. I was playing earlier just a little bit from your TED, which is a big deal, you know, to be on TED, to be able to speak there. It looked like there's the ocean. Is that the ocean in the back?
That's the ocean.
Oh man, yeah, I'm from Jacksonville, Florida, so I miss the ocean. I'm here in Atlanta. We don't have a beach.
You're not far away.
So let's get into this interview here, and I'm excited because again, you know, it's exciting to be able to have someone as yourself in academia and someone who is a researcher, someone who's in the field, to be able to grace us with your presence here. And so I'm excited about that. So before I get into it, I'll ask you to, I kind of ask you to give your resume because I don't want to miss anything, and just do a rundown of young Tudor to now Sir Tudor, Dr. Tudor, Professor Tudor.
Well, that's a long period of time, but I mean, I think I'll try and concentrate on the Lemba story and my association with the general question of Black Jews over a very long time. So I'll tell you how I kind of got interested in the issue of Black Jews. So one day I was invited to have lunch with somebody who at the time was the chairman of the Jewish Chronicle, which is a British Jewish newspaper. It's a very old one. It's been going for about 150 years or so. And so anyway, he took me to his home and we had lunch. And in the middle of the lunch, he said, I've heard that the Ethiopian, this is not the Lem, but this is the Ethiopian Jew. I hear that they're being poisoned in the refugee camps along the border between Ethiopia and the Sudan. And we would like you to go and find out what's going on and write a report. Because in addition to being the chairman of the Jewish Chronicle, he was also on the board of a very fine organization called the Minority Rights Group. So I agreed, and a few days later, I found myself in Karachi and got on a bus, went to the border of the Sudan with Ethiopia, and went to, there were a number of refugee camps built along the border because it was the time, if you remember, well, you won't remember, you're too young, but of the great Ethiopian famine, which was about 1985. Remember Bob Geldof and others, you know, put real famine on our television screens for the first time during that terrible Ethiopian famine. And so people were flooding over the border, including thousands and thousands of Ethiopian Jews who wanted to get to Israel. So, you know, I was there, and it didn't take me very long to realize that something bizarre was happening. And the bizarre thing that was happening was that the Israelis were on the ground. I heard people speaking Hebrew to each other. I speak Hebrew. And I thought, well, you know, this is clearly a secret operation, because, you know, Sudan doesn't even have diplomatic relations with Israel. So this must be high secret. But at the same time, you know, it was, they were talking to members of the Sudanese police and secret police, as I assume. So I thought I'd better get out. So after a few days, I went back to Khartoum, went to the bar, looked for a drink, failed in my quest, had an orange juice instead. And there was a guy sitting at the bar, and we started to chat. And it turned out that he'd read Oriental languages at Oxford, same as me. So, you know, we started to talk about this and that, and, you know. And so he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm writing a report on the Ethiopian Jews. I've just come back from the border, from this refugee camp, which was called Kariba. And his face went pale. And he said, I'm not hearing this. What are you talking? I mean, this is not possible. You can't be doing this. I want you to get on a plane and get back to England as quickly as you can. And I said, hang on, man, I'm here to do a job. I'm not going to just up sticks and go back to England. Anyway, he told me that he was Mossad and that he was there on behalf of the Israeli government, and he was coordinating this secret airlift, which was called Operation Moses. So that was my first introduction to Ethiopian Jews. And so I went eventually back. I had an agreement with this guy, and you know, good Englishmen together. We shook hands on it, and he said, "You go and do research, but don't publish anything until I tell you can do so." So I was true to my word. I went, I took notes, I saw what was going on, took a few photographs, tried to keep out of the way, and got back to England. And I guess it was probably about 6 weeks later, the story was pretty much on the front page of every newspaper in the world. And this guy called me from Israel, and he said, okay, I'll tell you the real story.
Wow.
And he flew over from Tel Aviv the next day. He came straight to my place in London. And so we started to talk, and he told me what happened. I wrote a book, Operation Moses, which was one of my first books. And then a few months later, I was invited to go to South Africa and to give a talk on this very subject, on exactly what happened, Operation Moses, how Israel rescued these starving people from the refugee camps. And, you know, it was a kind of pretty middle-class, white, Jewish crowd of people that came to listen to what I had to say. But at the back, there were some people who looked very different. To start with, they looked very poor. They were wearing very poor clothes. Some of them weren't wearing shoes. And however, they were all wearing skull caps, yarmulkes. And so afterwards, I kind of went over and chatted to these people. And they said that they were Lemba. I'd never heard of the Lemba in my life. Lemba. And then they could tell, and they said, you know, we're Jews, we're just like the Ethiopian Jews. I said, yeah, sure. And they didn't believe, they could see I didn't believe a word of it. So they said, why don't you come and spend a weekend with us in our villages up in what was then called Venda. So it was way sort of north of Johannesburg. So I went up there into some mountain villages, spent some time, and I saw that what they were doing on the ground was clearly Semitic in some way. And so long story short, I went back to England, went to see my publisher, who was a certain great man called Lord Weidenfeld, Jewish publisher, but a great, not bad, but he was just a great man. And I told him the story. He was fascinated, and he said, "Okay, you're going to write a book about this." And so he patted me on the back, put some money into my account, and this was a few months later. I got leave from the university. I was a professor in those days at the School of Oriental and African Study at the University of London. And so I had 6 months pretty much. And so what I decided to do was interrogate their oral tradition. So the oral tradition was amazing. It was an interesting oral tradition. So, and they kept repeating it time and time again. I started in Soweto, Johannesburg, township. And there were a lot of Lemba people there in those days. And they said, well, the story is this, that we used to live in a place called Senna. And then we left Senna and we crossed Pusela. Eventually we came to Africa and we rebuilt Senna. And then we moved inland. And then one of our number ate mice, which was forbidden by the law. And the wrath of the Lord came down upon us. And from that day on, we were scattered among the nations. So this was the story. And so the way the legend went, they started at Senna, they crossed Pusela, they came to Africa, they rebuilt Senna. According to some of the legends, they built another Senna inland, and then the mouse thing happened, and then they were scattered. So in Johannesburg, I decided I'd follow this in reverse. First of all, I would have to find out where the inland Senna was, and where the other African Senna was, and only then could I have any hope of finding where they were from and discovering whether they indeed were, as they claimed to be, Jews and to be a lost tribe of Israel. There was nothing in Jewish history about this. Nobody had ever written about this tribe. Nobody had ever heard about this tribe. I was a trained kind of historian, Jewish historian, and I studied Hebrew and Arabic at Oxford. I was a professor at one of the most prestigious universities in the world, and I never heard of them. So off I went, and I spent a lot of time living with the Lemba in their villages. So, when I say a village, it would be kind of probably 3 hours, 4 hours away from the nearest town, or sort of running water. I mean, these were very, very simple places. And, you'd get there on a dirt track. There was no finished road. You get there on a dirt track. I rented a car, and I finally turned up after many adventures in a particular village called Mapuzi. And in those days, the paramount chief of all of the Lemba people was to be found in this village Mapuzi in Zimbabwe. And I spent a long time there because what I learned there was from the old men. The women don't come into the story at all. Sorry, girls, but it's just the way that it was. And so it was men's secrets. Women were never present. And over a drink, probably in the evening, round a fire, they would tell me the oral tradition of the tribe, and I would busily write it down. And they also told me the route that they had taken. So the route was something that was never written down. That was never part of any written tradition. It was oral tradition. And it was very detailed. So we came down a valley, and it was called the Valley of the White Monkeys. And then we saw a place with a certain kind of tree there, a maruba tree. And it was there that we turned north, and we went there for a while. It was that sort of thing, but very, very detailed. And I assiduously made note. And eventually, when the time came to move on, and I did so with great reluctance, because the time I spent in that village was perhaps the happiest in my life. Just living with those people was wonderful. And there was a daughter of the young girl, she was 16, 17. Every morning she would bring me water for me to wash my hands. And, you know, they really looked after me like a lost son. It was incredible, it was lovely. And I was able to do some very nice things for them as well later. Not on this occasion, but later I saved them because I guess it was maybe 10 years later or something like that. There was a terrible famine in Zimbabwe, and I was able to fill a big Mercedes up with food and get it into Maposi's little village. And I know that saved them. So, but anyway, they were incredibly kind, and they were always very, very kind to me, and I was always very happy to be there. But when I moved on, so I had this kind of roadmap, which was constructed from their oral tradition. And the oral tradition had been collected from people from a wide area. It wasn't just from Maposi or from the villages around, it was from all over Zimbabwe, because as soon as they heard that there was a scholar interested in their story, people would come from far and from wide, and we'd sit around and they would talk and they would tell and they would compare and so on. So this is the way it was, and that's what happened. So eventually I got to, I followed the tradition. For a lot of the way I walked, going from one place to the next and following these little clues. There was a clue here and there was a clue there. You get to a certain mountain, there's a cave and so on. And then you ask somebody there and they'll tell you. So it went on for a few months of doing this. And eventually I got to the sea, basically. And this is the east coast of Africa. And when I got to the sea, pretty much things, the clues kind of ran out. Mm. I found a few rocks here and there, and near where the city of Senna was supposed to have been rebuilt, but this city had been destroyed long ago, and you couldn't really build much from this. But it was clear that there had been a city where they said there was a city. And so I got a little Arabian dhow. It's a single-sailed, single-mast traditional sailboat. And I kind of went in the general direction where they said they came from, and I knew that I didn't know where I was going. I just did it for a few days, and I wrote a conclusion. There's a big question mark here. I don't know. I can't really take this any further. So that was the first version, if you like, of that book, Journey to the Vanished City. Essentially, I didn't really find the vanished city. But then, a couple of years later, I was doing a different book, different place. I was in the Yemen. Mm. And I was traveling down this incredible valley in what used to be South Yemen. It's called the Hadramaut, which is mentioned in the Bible. And there'd been Jews living in the Hadramaut, we know, for a couple of thousand years, as it happens. But I didn't know that then. But I was just researching in the Hadramaut, and I was talking to this Muslim sort of holy man, mm-hmm. and very nice chap. We were having lunch together, and he said, "What are you doing? Why are you here? If there weren't any tourists in this place." I said, "Well, I'm a professor. I studied at Oxford. I know Hebrew. I know some Arabic." And then I told him the story about the Lemba, how they came from the north, from a place called Senna. They crossed the Sailor. They crossed. They got to Africa. And he said, "That's a very interesting story. It's an incredible story, because if you keep going down the Valley Hadramaut, there is a place called Senna, and there's an ancient tradition whereby they used to have a dam which permitted agriculture, which permitted irrigation. And then, about 1,000 years ago, this dam broke, and the people who lived there, they went down the valley, which is called Masila, and they got to the sea, and that place where they got to, it had a port in those days. It was called Sahyut, which was the great port for trade with Africa. And so I speculated that this is the Senna that they came from. I don't think it was the ultimate Senna, because at about the same time I realized that the sort of Judeo-Arabic word for Zion is Sayuna. Well, Sayuna and Senna sound pretty much the same. So I thought, well, Zion, Senna, okay, this, you know, you've got this valley, the Masila, it sounds like Masela a bit. And if you write it, it looks actually the same, in Arabic anyway. And because the F and the M look almost identical. And so I thought, this is interesting. I mean, it really looks kind of as if it's plausible, but it's not exactly a smoking gun. You know, you couldn't be sure as a sober historian that this really hangs together. So then I decided that this is the time to bring genetics into it. And of course, it was only about then that you could use genetics in this way. And so I went back to London and spoke to some colleagues at University College, part of University London in those days. It's now very famous because of the coronavirus. A lot of the great scientists and so on at University College. And so a couple of us, a geneticist and me, we went to the Lemba lands in South Africa and Zimbabwe. We collected a lot of DNA samples, such as the one that you've got, from different Lemba people, but also tribes around. It wasn't just the Lemba, it was other Bantu groups of people, you know, Shona groups and so on, Karanga groups. So we could really make a good kind of comparison of why they were different, if they were different. And then we went to the Yemen, and we went back to the Hadramaut, and we did a big collect right down the Hadramaut as far as Senna. We went even as far as Senna, and we collected from the Bedouin and the people that lived in Senna. Really, it's the end of the world. If ever there's an end of the world, it's there. And we really, we had a lot of many samples, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of samples, far more than we needed for it to be statistically valid. And then, okay, we took our DNA into test tubes. What you do, as you know from doing it, but maybe some of the people watching don't know, is you take a little swab, you just rub it inside the cheek, you put it back in a test tube, you put some preserving liquid in it, you screw it up, and you fill in a form, of course, so that the people that you're taking it from know what you're doing, why you're doing it, and you take certain information about them, where they were born, where their fathers were born, where they live, their age, etc., their religion, and so on, various kind of statistical stuff. And then we go back to the lab, so the geneticists take over, and they analyze the stuff that they've got there. And it came in two chapters, if you like. So the first chapter was on the basis of getting the raw data out of the DNA and then eyeballing it and thinking, what is this saying? What is this doing? And it was immediately obvious. It was immediately obvious that the Lemba were from the Middle East. There was no question at all about that.
Wow.
Not only, it was perfectly clear that there's an overlap between the Lemba and the people of the Hadramaut. So if you put the two together, you could look at one lot of things and look at the other lot of things, and you could see that there's a considerable overlap. And so I thought, well, this is really, really unbelievably exciting. It's almost the end of my quest, but it's not quite the end of my quest, because there are a lot of people who live in the Middle East and they're not all Jews. But how, and this is the question, how can you determine if somebody's Jewish from DNA? You know, how can you tell a religion from DNA?
Right.
How can you? So, you know, we pondered this. And then it was at about the same time I was walking down Gower Street. I mean, if you're a Lember, this should be a place of pilgrimage, because it was on Gower Street that the idea that led to the discovery was made. So I'm walking down Gower Street in front of University College, and with my friend, who's a geneticist, and he was explaining genetics to me. I knew a bit by then, but anyway, he was saying, you know, the thing is that there's the Y chromosome, and it's only men who have it. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if your Y chromosome is going to be the same as your dad's, and his is going to be the same as his dad's, and his dad's is going to be the same as his dad's, and it goes back in history, unchanging forever. That's the way the Y chromosome works. Women don't have it, so they don't come into the story. Now they're doing very complicated stuff with female DNA, but that's another matter. But as far as the male DNA is concerned, the Y chromosome, which only men have, women don't have it. You know, this was the thing. And I said to him, well, isn't this interesting? Because that's exactly the way that the Israeli priesthood works. You can only be a priest if your father's a priest, and he can only be a priest because his father's a priest. So theoretically, the line of priesthood goes right back. Theoretically, this line of priesthood goes right back to the temple. Mm-hmm. So anybody called Cohen, which is the Hebrew for priest, you know, or another priestly name, Katz is another priestly name among Jews. Theoretically, they go back as far as the temple and beyond. I mean, technically, they would go back as far as the time of Moses and his brother Aaron, who's the founder of the priesthood. And so he said, hey, wow, we could do a study. I mean, that would be a really interesting thing to do. Why don't we look at the Y chromosome of as many people who call themselves priests as we possibly can and see whether the story of descent is true? So we collected this time hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who self-identify as priests. And what did we discover? Well, we discovered that around 55% of the people that we tested have got a particular chromosome, which is on the Y chromosome. He's got a particular haplotype rather than the chromosome, but a particular haplotype, a constellation of genetic material, which goes back for a couple of thousand years. And we can see where the original ancestor was by reading the DNA, because your DNA is something that can be read by geneticists, just like a history book that everybody has. So you look at that and you can trace it down the years. And they were able to say the date. It seems incomprehensible, doesn't it? You know, to those of us who are not geneticists.
Yeah.
But every generation, there's a minuscule change. Rather, if you think of an oak, and you know, with every year, there's another line. If you chop an oak tree down, you look at the lines of the wood, and you can see how many years, how old the tree is. And so it is with the Y chromosome. So going back in history, every generation has got these tiny little changes, these modifications, and you can count them, or geneticists can count them. So they figured out that it was actually 3,200 years. 3,200 years as it happens.
Wow.
According to our best estimates, is when Moses, the story of Moses and the Exodus was happening. So an incredible, incredible, incredible story that you would never have imagined was possible. How could one, before genetics, have ever come up with something that kind of proves the theory of the priesthood? Unbelievable, unbelievable. So the newspapers of the world had a field day. It was everywhere. There were films, and there were this, and there were that. I was on 60 Minutes, and lots of stuff. A lot of publicity were given to it. And then we went back to the lab, and we went back to the Lemba story. By this time, we had this haplotype, this precious priestly haplotype. We didn't know about it before. But when we compared the precious haplotype with the DNA that we got from the Lemba, we discovered that overall, that within the priestly tribe, which is the Buba tribe, within the priestly tribe, the incidence of this Cohen modal haplotype, as it's called, was the same as it is among Jewish people throughout the world. So this again, so at this point, I could reasonably say that the quest was over. And the quest, why did the quest happen? Well, the quest happened in part because I was excited by the idea and I had a book to write. But it was also because there was a chap called a professor, in fact, he was a Lemba professor at the University of the North, who became a very, very close friend. And on behalf of the Lemba people of South Africa, he asked me to undertake the quest. He said, will you please find out where Senna is? And so it was partly a mission on his behalf, on behalf of the Lemba themselves. And of course, it was partly on my own initiative because I like an adventure, or at least I did in those days when I was young. And so that pretty much is the end of that story. So I did a sort of new edition of the book, and if you get it's available on Amazon or secondhand or whatever. And the last chapter involves the Yemeni part and a discussion of the DNA part. So it's a really very interesting. It's a very, very interesting story. Of course, the impact of it upon the Lemba and upon the world has been considerable because, I mean, as in your case, your story is in itself a fascinating one. So, as far as the Lemba in Africa are concerned, as soon as they had this genetic scientific corroboration that they were associated with the Jewish people, in some way, it made them very much more serious about their stories of Jewish origins, although they probably would say now that that's not true. They were always quite certain, but I'm pretty sure that they were even more certain once this scientific proof came through. And certainly as far as Jews worldwide now, there are plenty of Jews in South Africa, white Jews in Johannesburg. They were not at all interested in the Lemba. They didn't believe their story. They didn't want to have anything to do with them. And, that was the kind of apartheid period. And, and I can remember speaking to one South African Jew, a white Jew, and I said, we're talking about the Lemba. I said, well, I wouldn't feel very comfortable about, the Lemba coming to my synagogue. It's like having my gardener come to the synagogue. What am I going to be doing with my gardener in the synagogue? So it's both it was kind of snobbish on the one hand, it was racist on, it was just not nice at all. And that was, to be honest, that was the situation. I think it's changed to a very considerable degree since then, but once this came through, it made a difference. It made a difference, not necessarily to the more racist South African Jews, because they were beyond, reason, I think, in terms of their racism. But certainly North American Jews and European Jews, they changed their mind. And, Jewish kids go to Sunday school and they learn about the Jewish people. And since then, if any kind of teacher is talking to Jewish kids about the different sorts of Jews that there are throughout the world, they'll mention the Lemba. Or indeed, if you pick up any biology textbook and, they're talking about the way in which nationality or ethnicity could be expressed, because it's a complicated matter in your genome. The Lemba is one of the best examples in the world. It's always, always, always mentioned. So, for two reasons, the Lemba became quite prominent throughout the world, I think. And, we'll have to see what happens. And in 100 years' time, I won't be around. I guess you won't either.
Dr. Parfitt, let me ask you this. Because you gave that rundown of how you come to the place where you're at right now is something that researching you and looking at all your videos, you haven't given that rundown that I've heard. So it was definitely in depth, but I want to ask you a question. Based on like all of your research, study, and years of education, it still wasn't any written tradition or anything written down. So I think that's kind of especially in America, that's kind of the issue. It's hard to believe that someone of my melanin complexion would say, hey, my family descends from ancient Israelites. And it's like, yeah, right. Where is this written down in history? This is the question that's constantly coming up. Where is this written down in history? We can't find any of that. But you being honest researcher, want to find out where things are at and really taking an honest approach. It brought you to the conclusion with genetics and just your thorough research, because many people can't travel and be in the field in the months that you put into it. But you didn't stop there because you were driven by truth. And I think that that's what many people, if we take on the mindset of being driven by truth historically, you came to the conclusion that there was no doubt, without a shadow of a doubt, that the Lemba had come from the Middle East or Israel. And so what would you say I guess it would be as encouragement to many people who are in America as Israelites, as Jews, or Black Jews or whatnot, as encouragement to not get discouraged, because there is no pretty much written tradition of like maybe a European Jew would have?
Well, it's a great question, and there's also a great answer. And of course, I know many of the American community through my work. We've had a few conferences with respect to Black Israelites and Black Jews down here in Miami. I guess we've had 2 or 3 conferences over the years since I've been here. But the question about the oral tradition is this, that just about everywhere in Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia, which had a written tradition, but south of the Sahara, Black Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, there wasn't a tradition of writing, not until the arrival of Islam on the west and the east coast. And certainly as far as the East Coast was concerned, that was a very, very narrow strip of cultural influence going right down the East Coast. And in the West Coast, it was later anyway, and it didn't really affect, the inland areas to any extent. However, it would be a great mistake to believe that just because there wasn't an oral tradition, just because there wasn't an oral tradition doesn't mean to say that there wasn't a reliable tradition. It doesn't have to be written down. You can write something on an envelope on the basis of something that you did yesterday, and your wife can write something on an envelope which will be her version of what happened yesterday. If you were to compare it a few days later, you'll see that, is this the same story? Right? So the fact that it's written down doesn't in itself make it authentic. And in any event, in African society, what you had was very often a situation where at court, you'd have a king, and there would be nobles and so on. But one of the functionaries at court would be, as a historian, his job would be to collect and to remember and to pass on. The Jews, similarly, I mean, if you look at, on the one hand, the Bible, and then on the other hand, the Mishnah, which is a collection of mainly legal material, but not only, it's got a lot of other sort of material in it as well. For a long time, that was oral, and it's called, to this day, it's called the oral tradition. Mm-hmm. And it was passed on from hundreds and hundreds of years before the final compilation of the Mishnah, which is about 200 of this era. But, it's probably it's 1,000 years old, a lot of the material in the Mishnah. And historians of Africa maintain that there was a very, very precise oral tradition, simply because of the way in which people remembered and passed on. They collected, they remembered, they passed on. So it's really intriguing. If you move on to another interesting thing is the ark-like object that I found or rediscovered in about 2008. Now, oral tradition said that, this is called the Ngoma. That's what we call it. It's kind of like the ark, and it's built upon a previous one. And round about 500 years ago, maybe 6, it exploded and did a lot of damage. This was in a warlike situation, and then it was reconstructed. And the one that we have is the reconstruction. It happened 500-600 years ago. That was the oral tradition. So I finally find this object, which apparently is the original Lemba Ngoma, and has been recognized universally as being the original Ngoma. And carbon dating of the Ngoma puts it almost exactly as it's around about 1300 and something. So, 500-600 years ago is precisely what it is. So the oral tradition actually was very, in this particular case, it was pretty accurate. And so I think it is in terms of the various traditions, the Senna story, and the remnants of kind of Israelite law that they have preserved. There's not that much, but there is some. And but recently, just for the benefit of the brothers, they don't know much about this because the book's not out yet, but it will be soon.
Okay.
And so I discovered 3 years ago, I mean, you know, I wrote that book, which I believe you ordered, which is, you know, Black Jews in Africa and the Americas. And when I wrote that book, I had never heard of a place called Loango. Didn't mean anything to me. Even though one or two people had mentioned it, you know, it wasn't sufficiently interesting to me to include it in my book. But, you know, I came across something that was written in German in the middle of the 18th century. And then I found a lot of other German material and French material and other stuff, which proves, and it's absolutely 100%. I mean, this I can, you know, here I've got written proof. I seem to have lost you.
Can you see me? Can you see the?
Oh yes, I can. Okay, so fine. Okay. Sorry about that.
You see Amazon.
And, so anyway, my research has demonstrated that there was a community that was founded right at the beginning of the 16th century, and yes, it would almost certainly be the end of the 16th century. It might have been the end of the 15th century. Way down in the on West Africa, which is where most of the Black community in the United States came from. And the slaves were brought from West Africa, not from East Africa, for the most part. There were some who went from Mozambique and such like, but not many compared with the vast numbers that came from the West. And in fact, Loango, where my community was one of the places from which the largest number of slaves came from. Certainly the French, who exported slaves to Haiti and such places, they took a very, very large proportion of their slaves from Loango. So there we know that, you know, we just know that there was a Jewish community. It was still there in 1880. It had been there since the early part of so 300 years. They were Black, and this was a great puzzle. And the great scientists of the time, they didn't understand how color happened. And they assumed that if you took a white man and you put him on the tropics and left him there for a while, he'd turn black. And so this was one of the great debates of the period of the Enlightenment, was what causes color? You know, how does it come about? And I mean, this was, it's an incredibly interesting story. I mean, the discovery of color difference, right? And this book is, my latest book is about that. But, you know, when people talk about, you know, yeah, I mean, people will say, I mean, look, there are no Jews in Africa, no Black Jews in Africa. It's not really possible to be a Black Jew and so on. It's, you know, maybe they converted, but any kind of historical connection is impossible, is complete rubbish.
Dr. Parfitt, let me ask you this, because what you're saying is essentially that, because we hear this, you know, in circles that I'm in, is that if you are a Black Jew, somewhere throughout the generation you converted to Judaism or some form of ancient Hebrew culture. But what you're saying is that doesn't have to be the case. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, in the case of in the case both of, if you accept that the Lemba are originally Jewish, and if you accept that the evidence is sufficiently strong, and maybe it's slightly circumstantial, maybe. you really have to put a lot of, you have to place a lot of faith on the genetic argument with respect to the Cohen modal haplotype and so on. But it seems to be robust enough to carry the story. But in the case of the Black Jewish community of Loango, there it goes definitely to the next level. Whether, no, I mean, in that particular case, we know how it came about. I mean, there's no question about how it came about. It came about simply because there was some orphans who were exiled from Spain at the end of the 15th century. And this was during the exile of the Jewish community from Spain, which was 1492. They went to Portugal. Because they didn't have any money, because they were orphans, they were poor kids, some 600 of them became the slaves of the King of Portugal, who'd recently discovered, or at least the Portuguese had recently discovered, an island which was way, way, way south, just around off the coast from further south than Nigeria. And he sent these little kids to this island. And so the idea was that when they became mature, you know, they got married off to men and to women from Angola, which was already a Portuguese colony. So some of these settled, so I don't know exactly when, nobody knows, but they settled in Loango. It was a coherent community. It was what their practices were, I have absolutely no idea, and nor does anybody else. But there were Black Jews who called themselves Black Jews or something similar until 1870, when there was a scientific expedition from Germany that spent quite a long time in Loango. And this is all written up in German in maybe half a dozen great big fat scientific tomes. This is no fanciful nonsense at all. This is absolutely, there was a Black Jewish community in Loango, full stop. And why they were black? They were black because if you take some people and you intermarry with Black people and this goes on for many generations, that's the color you become. And full stop. I mean, it's not very difficult to become black, right? I mean, I can't become black, but my grandson can become black. You know, it depends what my son is doing, and you know, so that's you know, the argument that you can't have Black Jews it's obvious. It's obvious rubbish. You obviously can, and there are plenty of cases anyway, historically of you know, people. I mean, Jews who've had you know, it doesn't take much. All it needs is a white. It needs a Jewish mother. It doesn't matter who the father is. The father can be you know, the father can be anybody. It doesn't matter. For Jewish law, it's the mother. Now, if the father is Black guy, chances are you know, the offspring eventually, somewhere down the line, is going to be Black, and there you've got a Black Jew. So being a Black Jew is no miracle, and it's really not it shouldn't be a major issue for anybody, and it won't be, because before this coronavirus started, I was all set to write a book which would have argued that you know, we're really coming to the end of the racial age. It started in the 17th century, and you know, I mean, there's plenty of racism around, particularly in the United States, but elsewhere in the world as well. But it's really its last gasp, and you know, another 10, 20 years, I think there's not going to be much the sort of racism we see here at the moment in the United States. It will all be over. I'm pretty sure that even by the end of the next administration.
I want to kind of get into looking at some of the books that you have. I know we have people watching, so I want to get to that here really quick. Let's see here. Let me try to screen share here. And so this is your Amazon. I think earlier when I lost you, I was on your Amazon. And
all right, I see, yeah.
All right. So this is like your first book. This was you have a book on all the way back to the 80s? Was that your first book, The Road to Redemption?
No, it was the one just next to that was
this one here
before, which was the Jews in Palestine.
Oh, the Jews in Palestine. Okay.
Yeah, that was based on my doctoral thesis. And the one about the Yemen, which is the one with the blue cover.
Okay, let me go back.
That was done in the 90s. And so it was that book that I was researching when I came across the nice Muslim, cleric who told me about the existence of Senna at the end of the valley. And, well, you can see Operation Moses there.
Mm-hmm.
So that was, that was written just after the actual operation in 1984, 1985. And then the 13th Gate, actually there's a chapter in that. You can find that. It's available on Amazon if anybody wants to try and get it. Secondhand probably, but anyway, it is available. And that has a chapter about the Lemba. And it really is my first impression of the Lemba. It was before I'd written the Journey to the Vanished City. So it's got some historical interest of, the original conversations I had. And then the Last Ark of the Covenant is the book I wrote about this object of the Lemba, which they called the Ngoma. And I think that's, for anybody who's interested, it's a fun read. It really is a very, very readable book. And you can still get that one. That's one of the ones, and that's translated into many languages as well.
Okay.
So if anybody wants it in Spanish, it exists in Spanish, it exists in Portuguese. If any of your brothers are from Brazil, then it's available also in Portuguese and so on.
Now, any of these, I see the Lost Ark of the Covenant and Black Jews in Africa and in Americas. Now, both of them are on Kindle. Are they going to be available in like hardback, paperback, or can you special order that? Or
I think if you, I think that probably Black Jews of African Nation. I mean, I haven't tried, but I would imagine that that's still, it's a fairly recent book. It was 2012. So you should be able to order that.
Okay, yeah, I see it here, hardcover through Prime. Okay.
All How much is it?
This one is 30. This one is 32, and the Kindle is 18.
Yeah, right. Well, 32 is good value, I'd say, because it means that it's they've still got some. And if you look underneath that, there are some even cheaper, that are secondhand or something. And
that's about the average for a good book.
Well, that book is easy to get for folk, and the Journey to the Vanished, the Lost Ark book is definitely available. I know that they printed quite a few.
And let me ask you this, Dr. Parfitt. Here in just within here, you're going to be dealing with, for those who would be interested in ordering it. So you talk about the Ashanti, the Tutsi, and the Igbo. Now the Igbo has, that's kind of been talked about here recently, even with some Ashkenazi Jews, in kind of validating their oral tradition and things like that. So do you have anything on you want to say, just kind of researching about the Igbo Jews?
Well, there are, I mean, here we're getting into a different area.
Okay.
Slightly. Now, one of my students, you may know him, Remy Alona, who's, sort of a big man when it comes to the Igbo Jews in Nigeria.
Right.
And, you know, there are many theories about how they got there. And I don't know the answer. I'm not, you know, dismissing it, but I don't know the answer. I don't think it's the way they present it.
Okay.
I really don't think it's the way they present it. But, you know, there are so many possibilities, one of which is that there were Jews all the way down the West Coast. There's no question about this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, right down from, I suppose, Mali, starting off with Mali and places like Timbuktu and Senegal. There were Jewish communities. They weren't very large Jewish communities, but there were Jewish communities from the end of the 15th century on. So if you're looking for a more recent and more historically provable connection between Jews and these places, you should certainly be looking at that period initially, because there's bags of evidence, and it's there to be found. You just go to the Portuguese archives, and you're going to find masses of material about these Jewish communities going right down the coast of Africa, and including some of the islands off the west coast as well. There's plenty of evidence there. If you're going back to a much earlier period of a couple of thousand years ago, there is some evidence, and not 2,000 years old, but there is some evidence, let's say 1,000 years old, but it's not very clear what's being discussed. And probably most of the evidence that we do have, it's probably more likely to have something to do with the Ethiopian Jews than anything in the west of Africa. So I would say that you know, from the end of the 15th century, we're talking 500 years. Mm-hmm. Certainly for the last 500 years, there have been Black Jews living in Africa, West Africa, and quite deep down Black Africa. I'm not talking about, you know, Morocco, Tunisia, places like that where we know, or even let's say Mali, which is not really sub-Saharan, it's not sub-Saharan Africa. And you know, I mean, nobody's really studied it very much. I mean, there are some things, but it's people looking for these ancient lost tribe stories, and in the very nature of things, we're talking about something that happened 2,500 years ago. There's no evidence, and there's certainly no genetic evidence in that particular case, or at least none that I know of, and none that is probably plausible at the present state of genetic knowledge either. I think, but I may be wrong about that, but I don't think so. As time goes on and we can read the genome better, give it another 50 years, we'll have a much better idea of what history is all about. But at the moment, I would recommend people, if you're really interested in the history of Black Jews, then read about the Inquisition, read about the exile of Jews from Spain and Portugal, how they settled down the West Coast, how they intermarried with African people, and how they maintained a Jewish community which lasted in some cases for a long time. And it's not only true there, it's also true in East Africa, particularly Mozambique. And my colleague, Portuguese researcher, a lady called Marina Pignatelli, has done some interesting work looking at the Portuguese records with respect to Black Jews who get there at the beginning of the 15th century, 16th century, let's say. So, you know, and of course, many of these people were enslaved.
Yeah.
So that's the other question. So, you know, to deny that any Black Jews came to the United States from Africa, well, you can deny it if you like. I really would like to see the evidence. Right? So, it would be a very difficult thing to prove. So the probability is, given that so many slaves came from Loanga and so many slaves came from Senegal, some of those slaves were actually Jews. And I mean, unfortunately, we don't have any 19th century iteration of that. In the case of Muslims, we do have one or two cases where people were enslaved and they were in the, you know, in the slave camps in Alabama and places. And they were taught to read and write, not in many cases, but in some cases. And they wrote, you know, in Latin characters, you know, Bismillah or something like this, which was the Muslim prayer that they'd been brought up with as children. So we know for a fact, and we've got evidence, and there's some written evidence, that some of those slaves were Muslims. Unfortunately, we don't have the equivalent evidence that some of those slaves were Jews, but I'd be very surprised if that were not the case. Mm. And it's certainly impossible, and I defy anybody to deny that it happened. Mm. Because as soon as you can prove, as I have proved and as others have proved, and as my new book will show very, very clearly, that there were definitely Black Jews there. And you've got hundreds of references to this very fact, it changes the game a bit.
Wow. Well, we thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Park. Well, let me say it. Let me call you the British Indiana Jones, and as they have so eloquently called you and gave you that title, and it's very deserving. Like you said, you don't have a whip, but you probably have the hat.
Well, it's been great talking to you, and thank you very much for having me on your show. And it was great questions, and I hope that we keep in touch, and maybe sometime we'll do something together down in Miami.
Yes, I definitely look forward to that, and I'll definitely be keeping in contact. I got a list of books that I need to order, so I'll definitely be ordering a catalog full. And you've helped so many people. I mean, in the chat, they're commenting and things like that. So we definitely appreciate it. I know some of the Limba elders, they're on a different time zone. So many of them
that's right,
towards the midnight or of not. But I think I want to thank them for even pointing me to your direction. Kohan Hamadishi, an elder of mine, and I really thank him so much. And I have to get the book of the Ark, and he's very, speak great of you. And I was supposed to go there in September of this year, but with all the Corona stuff, had to delay my flight, me and my family, and so.
Well, let's hope you can go next year when things have quietened down a bit.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Parfitt.
That's great. You keep well. Many thanks. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye, everybody.
All right. So what's going on, family? That was it. Dr. Parfitt, we thank him for coming on, being honest, dropped a lot of jewels, man. I mean, it's always great to have someone in the field. Just wanted to respect his time, wanted him to be able to just really share his heart, his research and things like that. And so it doesn't get any better than that. I mean, it's someone who's in the field, actually doing the work. I'm telling you guys, you don't have to defend this stuff no more. Just continue to stay encouraged. continue to push forward. And I thank you all for tuning in. If you haven't watched, go back and watch. I'll be adding this to my YouTube channel, and you can go on YouTube and watch it from there and share it. And so I look forward to, once all of this over, be traveling to Miami, so that way I can go and really just kind of, you know, really sit down with them and build and, you know, come up with different events and things like that. And we'll really just be getting together. So I'm excited. Miami is great. He is the professor at Florida. I think it's Florida Atlantic International. I think that's it. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's it. But he is the professor there. He has a extensive resume of work, and so definitely excited about that. So shalom to you all. Blessings to you all, man. Grace, peace. You can go back and watch this after it's over and done. And so I am definitely out. Shalom.